Welcome back as we read Chapter 3, Otis's Scientific Experiment. One Monday morning when Otis went into room 11, he saw an excited group of boys and girls crowded around the ledge under the windows. I wonder what they're looking at, he thought, and climbed up on a desk so he could see over their heads. He saw two small wire cages. In each cage was a white mouse. Well, mice in the schoolroom, thought Otis. They should be good for more excitement. Otis liked animals, but Mrs. Brewster, the manager of the apartment house where he lived, did not allow dogs or cats. Until now, he'd not thought of a pet mouse. Mrs. Gittler came into the room. Otis, you know good citizens don't stand on desks, she said, and Otis jumped down. The whole class began to ask questions. What are the mice doing here? Do we get to keep them? Mrs. Gittler smiled. Take your seats, boys and girls, and I'll explain. They're not white mice, they're baby white rats. Our room is going to perform a scientific experiment. The class was impressed. Scientific experiment sounded important, especially if it meant they could have rats in the schoolroom, and baby rats were much more interesting than grown-up white mice. Mrs. Gittler went on. This week we're going to talk about good food. These are two baby rats. These two baby rats are exactly the same weight. Each weighs 40 grams. We're going to feed one of them the same food we eat for lunch in the cafeteria, and the other we will feed white bread and soda pop. We will weigh them once a week for 3 weeks to see which one grows faster. The class liked this plan. Otis thought it would be fun, too, even though he knew how the experiment would turn out because Mrs. Gittler would never do anything to prove that baby rats should drink soda pop. She would be on the side of milk and vegetables and the whole wheat bread they always had in the cafeteria. Ellen raised her hand. May we name the rats? That's an excellent idea, said Mrs. Gittler. Are they boy rats or girl rats? Somebody wanted to know. Boy rats, said Mrs. Gittler. They're twin brothers. Stewie raised his hand. Oh, we can name one rat Otis. Everyone laughed loudly at this except Otis, who made a face at Stewie. Then Patsy suggested Pinky because the rats had pink ears and tails. Although some of the boys objected, the girls all agreed that Pinky was a good name. Otis, who thought Pinky was a sissy name for a boy rat, waved his hand. I think Mutt is a good name for the rat. That gets the soda pop. Me too, said George, and the others agreed. So Miss Gittler smiled. It looks as if soda pop rat is named Mutt. Otis looked at Mutt and almost felt as if the little rat belonged to him because he named him. He watched Mutt sniff around his cage. Sometimes Mutt stopped to scratch himself with his front paw. Once he scratched with his hind paw like a dog. After a while, he settled into a corner of his cage. He put his head down, wrapped his hairless pink tail around his body, and went to sleep. All morning, Otis thought about the rats and wondered how he could use them to stir up some excitement. After lunch, the class gathered around the ledge to watch the rat monitors lift the wire cages and set down dishes of food from the cafeteria for two little animals. Pinky was served tiny bits of macaroni cheese, green beans, carrot and raisin salad, whole wheat bread, and raspberry jello. Pinky also had a few spoonfuls of milk. Mutt had a whole saucer of soda pop and half a slice of white bread. Poor Mutt, thought Otis as he watched the little rat lap up the pop. Bread and soda pop did not look like much for lunch, even for a rat. After school, Otis lingered by the rats' cages instead of trying to be the first one out of the classroom. He had several ideas for stirring up excitement, but there was something wrong with every one of them. Let the rats out of their cages? No, Mutt might get lost or stepped on. Switch cages? Oh, too easy for Miss Gittler to guess. Hide one of the rats in Miss Gittler's desk? Oh, she was not the kind of teacher to scream at the sight of a rat. Hide a rat in Ellen's raincoat pocket? Well, that might do if he couldn't think of anything better. It was the sort of thing that any boy might think of. Otis wanted to do something unusual. By Thursday, the children could see that Pinky was already larger than Mutt. His eyes were bright, and his fur was glossy. Mutt spent most of his time in the corner of his cage looking cross or mad. The class could hardly wait until Monday, when Mrs. Gittler would weigh the rats. When Monday came, she took Pinky out of his cage and set him on the scale. He weighed 90 grams, more than twice what he had weighed a week before. Mutt weighed 46 grams. He had gained scarcely at all. Room 11 was proud when Miss Joyce brought her class in to see the scientific experiment. Excuse my dogs in the background. A whole week had gone by. I can't waste any more time, Otis said to himself. Now I've got to think of something, and that day he did. At noon, when Otis took his place in the hot food line in the cafeteria, he noticed everyone making faces. When he looked at the steam table to see what they were having for lunch, Otis not only made a face, he groaned and held his nose. They were having scalloped potatoes with some kind of meat, Swiss chard, sliced beets, and rice pudding, and of course milk and whole wheat bread. Ugh, all the awful lunches, complained George, who was standing behind Otis. It sure is, agreed Otis. I don't see why we can't have hot dogs and ice cream every day. He gloomily handed the cashier his money. 20 perfectly good cents wasted. We could see that this was back a long time ago. That's why lunch is only 20 cents. He thought as he carried his tray to a table. Scalloped potatoes and Swiss chard? Otis carefully picked the meat out of his potatoes and ate that first. I'm sure glad I brought my lunch, said Tommy, who was sitting across from Otis, eating the centers out of his sandwiches. You're lucky, agreed Otis, poking fun of his Swiss chard. I don't see why this stuff would even be good for a rat. Hey, wait a minute, Otis suddenly thought. He was about to have an idea. He could feel it coming on. This might be very good food for a rat if he gave Mutt good food without anybody seeing him. Mutt might outgrow Pinky. That would really fix the experiment, because everybody would think it was white bread and soda pop that had made Mutt grow. He could see Miss Gittler's face, and boy, oh boy, the cafeteria would have to start serving soda pop. That was the best part of all, soda pop in the cafeteria. Otis was so pleased with his inspiration that he ate his beets and Swiss chard without even thinking about them. It was a perfect idea, difficult of course, but worth it. Already he could see cases of orange and pink and green soda pop stacked in the cafeteria. Now all he had to do was figure out what to feed Mutt and how to slip the food to him without being seen. That evening, Otis went into the kitchen where his mother was preparing dinner. She was in a hurry because she had got home late from the Spofford school of the dance. Otis, watching her drop a slab of frozen peas into boiling water and put 2 frozen cube steaks into a frying pan. I'm hungry, he said. We had an awful lunch at school today. The peas boiled over onto the stove. Run along, dear, and don't bother me, said Mrs. Spofford, wiping up the stove. Mother has been teaching tap dancing all afternoon, and she's tired. Otis leaned against the refrigerator. Say, Mom, isn't there something that's better for people to eat than scalloped potatoes? Mrs. Spofford forked 2 potatoes baking in the oven. Why, almost anything, I suppose. Milk and cheese and, oh, I don't know, lots of things. Cheese, of course. Rats like cheese. He should have thought of that himself. Otis helped himself to a piece of cheese from the refrigerator. Then he noticed a bottle of vitamin pills on the drain board. Say, Mom, can I have some vitamins? He asked. Yes, dear. Now please run along, said Mrs. Spofford as she turned the flame down under the meat. Otis added a handful of vitamin pills to the pieces of cheese in his pocket. Cheese and vitamins, that ought to make Mutt grow. Now all he had to do was find a way to slip them into Mutt's cage without being seen. That was the hardest part of his plan. When Otis arrived at school early in the next morning, he found the door of room 11 locked. In a few minutes, Mrs. Gittler appeared with the key in her hand. "Good morning, Otis," she said. "My, aren't you bright and early? I thought I'd come early and study my spelling," Otis explained. "If only Mrs. Gittler would unlock the door and go away." "Splendid," said Mrs. Gittler, giving Otis a surprised look. Or was it a suspicious look? Otis couldn't tell. Here he is, waiting for her to unlock the door. When Mrs. Gittler was busy writing some arithmetic problems on the blackboard, Otis left his desk and went to the rats' cages. Mutt was huddled miserably in a corner. Otis put his hand in his pocket and broke off a piece of cheese. "Otis," said Mrs. Gittler, without even turning around to look at him, "if you aren't going to study your spelling, you must go out on the playground until the bell rings." Otis took a seat. He had said he had come early to study spelling, so he supposed he had to sit there with a book in front of him. All morning Otis waited for a chance to slip food into Mutt's cage. By lunch period he was forced to form another plan. He went to the cloakroom and pretended he could not find his sweater. Then he waited quietly till all the other boys and girls left the room. He heard Mrs. Gittler shut the door. Then he heard something he did not expect. The key turned in the lock. Otis was locked in. As long as the door was locked, he did not have to worry about being discovered. That was something. Stooping, he could not be seen through the windows. Otis hurried to the rats. When he lifted Mutt's cage and put down a piece of cheese and a vitamin pill, the little rat scurried over to the food and nibbled greedily. Good old Mutt. He must have been awfully hungry. The trouble was, Mutt wasn't the only one who was hungry. Otis was hungry too. He wondered what the others were eating in the cafeteria. Maybe it was hot dog day. Otis watched Mutt finish the cheese and gnaw the vitamin pill, which slipped away from him until he learned to hold it with his paws. Otis was so hungry that he took the rest of the cheese out of his pocket. It was covered with fuzz, but he didn't care. He gave Mutt another piece and ate the rest himself. When it was time for the bell to ring again, Otis made sure there were no telltale crumbs in the cage before he hid in the cloakroom once more. "Where were you?" Stewie asked when Mrs. Gittler unlocked the door and the class streamed into the room. "I didn't see you in the cafeteria." "Oh, around," said Otis vaguely as he joined the group watching the monitors feed the rats. So it really had been hot dog day in the cafeteria. Watching Pinky nibble a piece of hot dog made Otis hungrier than ever. "Mutt isn't eating his bread," someone said. "Do you suppose he's sick?" "He's probably just tired of it," said Ellen. "You'd get tired of it too, if that's all you had to eat." Then she added, "Poor little Mutt." The next day, Otis brought more cheese and another vitamin pill to Mutt. He also brought a sandwich and a cupcake for himself. So he and the rat ate lunch together. Otis thought Mutt had grown a little already. If only he could keep on feeding him without being caught. The third day, Otis decided not to feed the rat at noon. Stewie had asked too many questions about why he wasn't eating in the cafeteria. "I think Mutt's growing," Otis heard someone say. "So do I. His stomach sticks out," Tommy said. "And he's frisky, too. Look at him." Otis was delighted with the way his private experiment was turning out. Just wait till Miss Gittler weighed Mutt. When he asked her if she didn't think the cafeteria should serve soda pop, she wouldn't have a thing to say against it. As he was leaving the room for recess, Otis made a detour past the cages in the hope that he could slip Mutt's food to him. Stewie followed close at his heels. "Why are you tagging around after me for?" Otis asked. "I'm just looking at the rat," said Stewie. "What would I tag after you for?" Otis decided he had better be quiet. He did not want to make Stewie suspicious. When Otis had no better luck feeding Mutt at lunchtime, he began to get uneasy. What if he couldn't get any food to Mutt? maybe the rat would lose weight and he would have to start his experiment all over again. Finally, as the class left the room to go to the auditorium for folk dancing, Otis managed to slip Mutt's food into the cage. Then he worried all during folk dancing. What if Mutt didn't eat it all up while the class was out of the room? But when they returned, Otis was relieved to find every crumb gone. Friday was worst of all. Otis scarcely had time for breakfast. He was so anxious to get to school early. The door of room 11 was locked as usual, and there was no opportunity to slip food into the cage during the morning. But lunchtime, Otis was desperate. Even though he had not brought a sandwich for himself, he hid in the cloakroom again and took a chance that Stewie would not miss him. When the classroom door was safely locked, he watched Mutt gobble the cheese he had brought him and look around for more. Hungry as he was, Otis gave the rat the rest of the cheese and a vitamin pill. Suddenly, Otis heard the sound of a key in the door. Mrs. Gittler was coming back. He looked frantically for a place to hide and made it in the cloakroom. Just as the classroom door opened, he crouched halfway between the cloakroom two doors. Just to be safe, he pulled someone's raincoat over him. He heard Mrs. Gittler lock the classroom door from the inside. Then he heard her walk across the room, humming to herself. Otis was afraid to move. He was almost afraid to breathe. Was she going to stay in the room the whole lunch hour? Oh, for Pete's sakes! He heard the drawer of her desk open, more humming, then a snapping noise. What could that be? A compact, of course. Mrs. Gittler was powdering her nose. Otis's left leg went to sleep. The drawer closed. A chair scraped. Mrs. Gittler walked down the side of the room by the windows. Would she? Yes, she did. She stopped by the rats' cages. Otis' right leg went to sleep. If only he could be sure Mutt had finished the vitamin pill. He tried wiggling his toes inside his shoes to ease the numbness in his legs. Just then, Mrs. Gittler started to walk toward the back of the room. Otis held his breath. He didn't know what he would do if she came into the cloakroom. Sorry, my dogs are playing in the background, and they're making a lot of noise. He heard her pause at one of the cloakroom doors. Then she passed it. He was able to breathe again as he heard her open a cupboard, take something out, and close it again. If only she would leave the room. Otis's hungry stomach began to rumble and then to growl. Frantically, he pressed his arms against his middle. His stomach made an interesting gurgling noise. He squirmed silently. His stomach growled back at him. Surely it was so loud. It was loud enough for Miss Gittler to hear. Mrs. Gittler's footsteps returned to the front of the room, and Otis heard her sit down at her desk. He heard papers rustling and decided she was settled for the rest of the lunch period. At least she couldn't hear his noisy stomach from the front of the room. Why did I ever think this was such a good idea anyway, thought Otis miserably. Maybe it wasn't such a good joke after all. Maybe the joke was really on him. Then he thought how close it was to rat weighing time. No, he couldn't give up. He would hang on a little longer. His legs felt as if they were stuck full of pins. Grimly, he listened for each minute to click by on the electric clock. Each minute seemed so long that he was sure the clock had stopped. Outside, he heard the children laughing and shouting. He wondered if anyone missed him. Finally, when Otis was sure he could not remain motionless another instant, the first bell rang, and Mrs. Gittler unlocked the door. He waited until the halls were filled with noise before he came out from under the raincoat. Then he clung to a coat hook with one hand while he tried to make his stiff, prickly legs work. Stewie was first in the cloakroom. He was eating a chocolate bar filled with almonds. Otis had to swallow before he could say, "Hi, what are you doing here?" demanded Stewie suspiciously. "I stayed in. I don't feel so good," said Otis, looking hungrily at the chocolate bar. And it was true. He couldn't think of a time when he had felt worse. Stewie hung up his jacket, popped the rest of the chocolate into his mouth, and licked his fingers. By that time, Otis's feet were working once more and were able to carry him into the classroom. As he walked past the rats' cages, he saw that the vitamin pill had disappeared, but he wondered uneasily what Mrs. Gittler had seen. He was glad his experiment was nearly at an end. He couldn't keep it up any longer, not even for soda pop in the cafeteria. When Monday morning finally arrived, Otis shoved his way through the excited boys and girls crowded around the rats. Sure enough, Mutt was bigger. Otis put his finger against the wall, with his whiskers quivering. Mutt put his front paws up on the wire and sniffed at Otis's finger. Good old Mutt, thought Otis. He knows me. He's just like my very own pet rat. And then Otis began to wonder what was going to happen to the rats when the experiment ended. Mutt was the only pet he had ever had. He was going to miss him when he was gone, unless maybe there was some way he could get to take Mutt home with him. Mrs. Brewster would not have to know about a pet rat, and Otis's mother was too busy to care. Otis went to the teacher's desk. Mrs. Gittler, what will happen to the rats when the experiment ends? He asked. We'll talk about that when the time comes, she answered, and went on working on her lesson plans. That only made Otis more anxious. After the class had taken their seats, he couldn't keep from watching Mutt, such a fine, healthy rat, and all because he had worked to make sure that he had good food. Otis had to find some way to keep him. As Mrs. Gittler took the scales out of the cupboard, Otis still had not thought of a plan. He wished she would hurry as he watched her adjust the weights and set Pinky on the scale. She slid the weights back and forth some more before she said, Pinky weighs 130 grams. She lifted Mutt out of his cage, weighed him, and announced, Mutt weighs 137 grams. Mutt was bigger than Pinky. Everyone began to talk at once. I've only one pair of ears, said Mrs. Gittler. I can hear only one person at a time. Secretly, Otis felt he had Mrs. Gittler in a pretty tight spot. He raised his hand and asked, if Mutt grew one more on white bread and soda pop than Pinky did on school lunches, doesn't that mean we should drink soda pop and eat white bread in the cafeteria? Soda pop in the cafeteria, everyone had something to say. Mrs. Gittler looked stern until the room was silent. Then she spoke solemnly. No, Otis, it does not mean that we should have white bread and drink soda pop in the cafeteria. She paused to look sadly at the class. It means that some boy or girl in this room has spoiled our experiment by feeding Mutt. Otis stared at his teacher. Leave it to Mrs. Gittler to guess what had happened. Much as he disliked admitting it, even to himself, he had to admire her. He couldn't put anything over Miss Gittler, at least not very often. Otis squirmed uncomfortably. Poor Mrs. Gittler. How disappointed she looked. To think that one of her boys or girls would spoil the scientific experiment. Now Otis did not know what to do. He had expected Mrs. Gittler to be surprised or maybe cross, not to look sad and disappointed. While Miss Gittler looked sadly at the class, Otis made up his mind to tell her what he had done. He would say he was sorry, and when Miss Gittler forgave him, he would ask for Mutt. But before he could get the words out, Ellen spoke. Miss Gittler, she gulped. Otis thought she sounded as if she was about to cry. I fed Mutt. He looked so little and hungry that I felt sorry for him. She gulped again and looked miserably at Mrs. Gittler. Otis stared at Ellen. Mrs. Gittler surprised him, but Ellen astounded him. Old Ellen Tibbet saying she fed Mutt just when he was going to tell what he had done. Well, he didn't believe it. It wasn't true. She couldn't have fed Mutt. Look at all the trouble he had trying to slip cheese and vitamin pills to him. How could you feed him without anybody seeing you? Otis demanded. Yes, Ellen, and tell us what you fed him, said Mrs. Gittler. Every day I wrapped some of my lunch from the cafeteria in a paper napkin. Ellen paused to sniff unhappily. And then I waited till everybody had gone home, and then I asked the janitor to let me into the room for a minute. I didn't mean to spoil the experiment, Mutt just looks so hungry. Ellen burst into tears. Now, why didn't I think of that? Thought Otis. That Ellen, he couldn't help feeling sorry for her. He looked so unhappy, but just the same, Mutt was his rat. There was an embarrassed silence until Miss Gittler said briskly, even if the experiment didn't turn out as we planned, I'm sure we all have learned the important thing. That is, we must eat good food if we are to grow and be healthy. That isn't what I learned, thought Otis. I learned you've got to be careful or some girl will get ahead of you. Austin raised her hand. Mrs. Gittler, if we aren't going on with the experiment, what is going to happen to Mutt and Pinky? We'll find good homes for them, Miss Gittler answered. Is there anyone who would like a pet rat? Otis waved his hand wildly, but Mrs. Gittler did not see him. She asked, who would like to take Pinky home? Otis stopped waving his hand. He wanted Mutt. The class finally decided Tommy should have Pinky. Stewie wanted him, but he already had a dog. Tommy, who had neither a dog or cat, could give a good home to a rat. Now was Otis's chance. He waved his hand frantically. Mrs. Gittler, he said, Mrs. Gittler. Otis knew she saw him, even though she said, yes, Ellen? Ellen twisted her handkerchief as she spoke. I know I spoiled the experiment, but I'd like awfully much to take Mutt home. I sort of feel like he's my rat. Otis didn't know what to do. He couldn't let Ellen have Mutt. He had to do something, but I fed him too, he protested. He's just as mine as Ellen's. I went without my lunch to feed him. Otis watched Mrs. Gittler anxiously. She just had to see how important it was for him to have Mutt for his very own pet. He felt everyone staring at him. Well, I did feed him, said Otis, when no one spoke, and I gave him vitamin pills. Besides, he's just as much mine as he is Ellen's. Well, Otis, aren't you rather slow in telling us about this? Miss Gittler looked stern, but Otis could see that behind her stern look she wanted to laugh. That was no laughing matter to Otis. I was going to tell, but Ellen beat me to it, he explained. Oh, I see, said Miss Gittler. Yes, Ellen, since you told us about feeding Mutt first, you may have him for a pet. Oh, that's no fair, muttered Otis, trying to cover up his disappointment. What did you say, Otis? Asked Miss Gittler. Nothing. Otis scowled and slid down in his seat. That Ellen Tibbets, taking his rat. Why, you wouldn't think a girl who was always neat and clean like Ellen would even like rats. That afternoon, Otis watched Mrs. Gittler put Matt in a chalk box for Ellen to carry home. It seemed to him that he had never wanted anything as much as he wanted Mutt for his very own. Well, it was too late. Too late now. He took one look at Mutt's bright eyes and quivering whiskers before he started home. When Otis reached the apartment house, he found Bucky, a kindergarten boy who lived in the same building, sitting on the front steps waiting for him. Although Otis didn't care much about playing with 5-year-old, he couldn't help liking Bucky because he knew the little boy admired him and wanted to be like him when he grew up. Hi, said Bucky, who was wearing his cowboy suit. Let's play like we're cowboys. Otis sat down on the steps. Not today, he said glumly, and began to pull a piece of rubber off the sole of his sneaker. He wished there was someone around to play with besides a little kindergartner. If only he had Mutt. Then Otis looked down the street and saw Ellen coming toward him. She had changed to her play clothes and was carrying the chalk box. She looked unhappy. Hi, said Otis, wondering where she was going. Hello, Otis. Ellen stopped in front of the steps. My mother says she won't have a rat in the house and I have to get rid of Mutt right away. I thought I'd give him to you because you fed him and you would take good care of him. She held out the chalk box. Otis took it and slid back the lid to look at Mutt, who was cowering in a corner. Gee, said Otis. Gee, thanks, Ellen. Gently he lifted Mutt out and stroked his soft white fur. Mutt snuggled in his hand. He's very own Mutt. Could I come and see him sometimes? Ellen asked timidly. Sure, any time. Otis decided Ellen wasn't so bad after all, even if she was always neat and clean and well behaved. As Ellen left, Bucky began to chat. Otis has a girl. Otis has a girl. You keep quiet, said Otis fiercely, or I'll. If you do anything to me, I'll tell the management on you, said Bucky. Well, keep quiet, or I won't let you play with my rat, said Otis. Bucky kept quiet. Tune in next time.